the way we think about God's nature, God's character, God's behavior is a big factor, if not the major factor, in our receiving answers to prayer. It's the main factor. So let me show you something in James chapter 1. In James chapter 1 in verse 5, talking about prayer here, James says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth liberally to all men, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. You see that? You can see that immediately after asking us to pray, he immediately begins to describe God. He begins to give us a description of God's nature, God's character, God's disposition toward us, God's heart toward us. Immediately begins to do that. You can see that, right? You see what he says? God who gives. God who gives to all men. God who gives to all men generously. God who gives to all men generously and does not upbraid, does not find fault. I hope you see it. It's an understanding, our understanding of God's nature, God's character, God's disposition toward us. Our understanding of that is what is called faith. Is what is called faith. Because look at the next verse. It says, let him ask in faith. When we are asking God for something in prayer, when we are making a request to God in prayer, we ask in faith. We are doing it in faith. Let him ask in faith. Faith that what? Faith in what? Faith in God's disposition. Faith that God giveth. That God giveth to all men. That God gives to all men liberally. That God gives to all men liberally and does not upbraid when we ask. That is our faith. You have to see that. That's what he's talking about here. God's nature, our understanding, our acceptance of God's nature, God's character, God's disposition toward us is the key that James is talking about here. You know what John calls it in 1 John chapter 5 verse 14 and 15? He calls this thing confidence. So let me read for you 1 John chapter 5 and in verse 14 and 15. Look at it. And it says, this is the confidence that we have in him, that if we ask anything, that's prayer, you can see that's prayer, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. No doubts, no ambiguities. He doesn't say, he might say yes, he might say no, he might say come back tomorrow, come back later. He doesn't say that. Verse 15 says, we know, since we know that he hears us, we know it. We know it. You can almost say it is beyond, it is another level of faith, if you like. It's a conviction. You say we know. We know it. No doubts, no ambiguities, no shades. Since we know that he hears us, verse 15, whatsoever we ask, we know that we have the petitions which we have desired of him. We know it. We know it. He uses the word know twice in that verse 15. Since we know that he hears us, we know he hears us, we know we have the petitions. We know. It's a conviction. It is called, he calls it confidence in verse 14. So back to James chapter 5. Let me dwell a bit on the word liberal here, or the word generous here. Look at it. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. God who gives generously, or God who gives liberally. 90% of the other versions of the translations, apart from the King James, they use the word generously. He gives generously. The Weymouth translation actually uses a different term entirely, and it says, it puts it this way: God who gives with an open hand. And actually, if you look at the root of the Greek word for generous or for liberal in that place, it actually also means the word, you can use the word unfolded in it. Unfolded. I hope you see it. Unfolded. The Weymouth translation says he gives with an open hand. So if it's unfolded, that means it's open. His hands are open. In other words, God gives generously. Nothing contained, nothing held back, nothing covered. Everything is there. He gives generously. He gives liberally. And he does not upbraid. He doesn't upbraid. The word upbraid here in the King James can be a little bit blind to us because it's King James English, it's Old English, but it means he will not rebuke you. He will not find fault with you when you ask. He will not revile you when you ask. He will not say, "You silly boy, you coming to me now? Now you remember there is a God, Abi." I'm speaking Nigerianese right there. God doesn't say that. So now you are in trouble now. Now you remember there is a God in heaven. You are coming to me now to help you. Did I not send the prophet to you? Did I not ask your pastor to tell you this? Did you not promise me you will never do it again? Now you're asking for help. I will not help you. Come back tomorrow. It says here, God does not upbraid us when we ask. What is James trying to do? He's trying to get us to think correctly. Wrong thinking. He's trying to save us from wrong thinking about God's nature, God's character, God's intentions, God's heart toward us. Because a lot of us believe that God will upbraid us when we ask, that God will bring all our past sins into remembrance when we come to prayer. Because a lot of us believe that some of the things that happen to us are because of the things that we have done, that we are only reaping the consequences. It's karma. We are reaping the consequences of everything. That some of us believe that God will not answer our prayer because we have done something wrong. But the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible doesn't say that. It does. In Christ, it does not say that. We believe that God will not answer my prayer because I did this last time, because I made a promise, I made a vow, and I didn't fulfill the vow. That's why God will not answer my prayer. James is trying to remove that mentality from us here. That's what he's saying here. He gives to all men. He gives, number one. Number two, he gives to all men. One version says he gives to everyone. He gives to all men, and he gives to all men liberally, and he will not upbraid when he does it, when we pray. And it says, it shall be given him. It shall be given him. God will give it. In other words, definitely will give it. He doesn't say it shall be given to him when God has time. He might say yes. He might say no. He might say come back later in 6 months. Nothing like that here. So when we say all these things about God's nature that are not true, it's just wrong thinking. We fear the wrong things. I hope you see it. And what James is trying to do here is really to give us correct understanding of God's nature, God's character, God's heart toward us. Look at the next verse, or next two verses. It says, let him ask in faith. Faith that what? Faith in what? Faith in God's nature. Faith in God's character that he has just described to us. That God gives to all men, that God gives to all men liberally, that God gives to all men liberally and does not upbraid. Let him ask in that faith. Nothing wavering, for he that wavers is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. So in other words, when we believe wrongly about God's nature and character, we will not receive anything. We will not receive. If we have second thoughts about God giving us, about God answering our prayer, we will not receive. And the question is not that God has not given it, because it says God gives. So there is no question about God's giving or God giving. There's no question about God giving liberally to all men. The last piece or the last part of verse 5 says, it shall be given him. The prayer request shall be given him. So let him ask in faith, nothing wavering, for he that wavers is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. Verse 7, for let not that man think. What man? The man who does not ask in faith. The man who is tossed by the wind, like a wave of the sea. Do not let him think that he shall receive anything of the Lord. You have to notice, like I said in other videos, you have to notice that it does not say that God will not give it. The giving part is already settled. Verse 5, the God that gives, it shall be given him. That's verse 5. It shall be given him. It shall be given him. Verse 7 says, do not let him think that he shall receive. It doesn't say, do not let him think that God will not give it. God will give it. God has given it. Now, don't let the man who does not come in faith, don't let him think that he will receive. Do not let him think that he will receive what is already given. What the Lord has already given. Don't let him think he will receive. Why? Because he has not come in faith. Because he must come in faith that God gives. He must come in faith that God gives generously. He must come in faith that God gives generously to all men. He must come in faith that God gives generously to all men and does not upbraid and will not upbraid when we ask. You see it? I hope you see it. The next verse says, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. In other words, the man who does not ask in faith is a double-minded man. Let me give you an example of double-mindedness. And we say these a lot sometimes. We say things like, oh, God might say yes. God might say no. God might say come back in 6 months. That is double-mindedness. I hope you see it. That is being double-minded. When we say stuff like that, we say stuff like sometimes God might heal that person. He might heal us too. We're praying for healing. God might heal. God might not heal. God might say, this sickness is my will for you. That is being double-minded. And really, when you think about it, if you really think about it, there's no point praying if you don't believe in if you don't have absolute faith that God will answer your prayer. What's the point praying? I mean, when we think like that God might not answer our prayer, there's no point praying. You are already defeated. And it says here, do not let that man think that he will receive anything of the Lord. A double-minded man should not think that he should not expect to receive anything of the Lord. Forget it.